The house was quiet, save for the dull hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaking of the old floorboards underfoot. Frank Hudson sat in his recliner, staring blankly at the flickering images on the television screen. The late news was playing, though he wasn't really watching it. His eyes, once sharp and alert, had grown cloudy in recent years, much like his mind. He was 72 years old, living alone in the house he and his late wife, Margaret, had shared for nearly 40 years. Margaret had passed 3 years ago, and since then, the house had felt emptier than ever. His children, Tom and Sarah, lived their own busy lives in different cities. They visited on occasion, but those occasions were becoming more and more infrequent. Frank didn't blame them. After all, he wasn't the man he used to be. His memory had begun to slip, like grains of sand falling through his fingers. At first, it was just little things, a misplaced key, forgetting a name. But over time, it had worsened. And then, there was the scratching. It started about a month ago, faint at first, almost imperceptible. It came late at night, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. A soft, scraping sound at the front door, as though someone, or something, was outside, trying to get in. The first time he heard it, Frank had dismissed it as a tree branch brushing against the house or perhaps a stray animal. But the next night, it came again. And the night after that. Each night, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Frank had gotten up several times to check the door, but there was never anything there. He had even gone outside with a flashlight, scanning the yard, looking for signs of a raccoon or a neighborhood cat. But he found nothing. It wasn't long before Frank began to dread the night. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it was fitful and filled with disturbing dreams. He found himself sitting in the recliner, dozing off only to be jolted awake by the terrible sound. The scratching gnawed at his mind, as relentless as it was maddening. One night, after being startled awake by the noise, Frank reached for the phone and dialed Tom's number. His hands shook slightly as he held the receiver to his ear. "Dad?" Tom answered after a few rings, his voice groggy. "It's late, what's going on?" "Tom, listen," Frank said, his voice unsteady. There's something outside my door. I keep hearing scratching, every night. It's getting louder. I'm not imagining this." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a sigh. "Dad, it's probably just an animal. You know how old houses are. They creak, they settle. You've lived there for years, you should know this by now." Frank clenched the phone tighter. "No, Tom. It's not just the house, it's something else. I'm telling you, I'll come by next weekend, okay? We'll check it out then," Tom said, his tone placating. "Just try to get some sleep, Dad. It's probably nothing." Frank hung up, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. His own son didn't believe him. Sarah, when he tried calling her the next day, had been no different. She had listened politely but quickly steered the conversation toward her own life, her work stresses, and her kids' extracurriculars. He was alone in this. Alone with the scratching. As the days passed, Frank's paranoia grew. The scratching wasn't just at the door anymore. It seemed to come from other places. He swore he could hear it in the walls, under the floorboards, and sometimes even behind him when he was sitting in the living room. The sound followed him, persistent and mocking. His sleep was fractured into uneasy moments of unconsciousness, broken by the insistent scratching and, now, faint whispers. It was as though the house itself was turning against him. The whispers started as little murmurs, indistinct and far away. Frank would hear them late at night, just as he was about to drift off. They were low, unintelligible voices that seemed to be speaking in a language he couldn't understand. At first, he tried to convince himself it was the TV or the radio, but soon enough, he began to hear them even when everything was off. The voices grew louder as the days passed, no longer whispers but guttural, rasping noises that filled the quiet of the house. Frank could swear he heard them saying his name. He tried telling Tom and Sarah again, calling them more frequently now, desperate for someone to understand. But they were always too busy, their conversations growing shorter, more distant. Each time, they brushed him off, dismissing his concerns as the product of his deteriorating mind. "You're just imagining things, Dad," Sarah had said during one call. "It's probably stress. You should think about moving into a place where they can help you. You don't have to be alone anymore." But Frank didn't want to leave his home. He didn't want to admit that he was losing control, that his grip on reality was slipping. It was bad enough that he had started forgetting things more frequently, but now this? No, he would hold on as long as he could. The scratching continued, growing more violent as Thanksgiving approached. Frank spent his nights pacing the house, checking the locks on the doors and windows, convinced that something was trying to get inside. He felt it in his bones, in the depths of his mind, a presence lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting for the right moment to strike. His isolation deepened. He no longer trusted his own senses. Every shadow, every creak of the house, seemed to harbor some malevolent intent. The walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating, and the whispers, they had grown louder, more insistent. Frank could hear them now even in the daytime, even when he was wide awake. They called his name, over and over, like a chorus of the damned. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, Frank was a wreck. His hands trembled constantly, and his eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles from countless sleepless nights. The scratching had become unbearable, a constant, maddening noise that echoed through his head. He had started barricading the door with furniture, convinced that whatever was outside would soon break in. On Thanksgiving morning, Tom and Sarah arrived at the house, as promised. They hadn't heard from their father in days, and though they had been busy with their own lives, guilt gnawed at them. They hadn't taken him seriously. What if he really was in trouble? When they pulled into the driveway, something felt off immediately. The house seemed different, darker, as though it were draped in an invisible veil of dread. The front yard, once neatly kept by their father, was now overgrown and wild. The windows were shut tight, curtains drawn, and the front door. It was covered in deep, jagged scratches. Tom glanced at Sarah uneasily before they both approached the door. "Dad?" Tom called as he knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Harder this time. The door creaked open slightly, revealing the dim interior of the house. An overpowering smell hit them immediately, a mix of decay and something else, something metallic. "Dad?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling now. They stepped inside cautiously, the floor creaking underfoot. The living room was in shambles. Furniture was overturned, cushions shredded, and strange markings were scrawled on the walls in what looked like dried blood. There were symbols neither of them recognized, crude drawings that seemed almost ritualistic. But what truly sent a chill down their spines was the sound, the faint, incessant scratching that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They followed the sound through the house, their hearts pounding. When they reached the kitchen, they froze. There, sitting in the middle of the floor, was their father. Frank was hunched over, his back to them, rocking back and forth. His hands were covered in blood, long streaks of it trailing from his fingertips. His nails had been torn off completely, and in their place were raw, jagged stumps. He was scratching the floor, over and over, his fingers grinding into the wood. His muttering was low, almost incoherent, but they could make out one word repeated endlessly: "Let me in. Let me in." "Dad," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Frank didn't respond. He kept scratching, his body swaying with each movement, his mind lost somewhere far beyond their reach. The voices in his head had won. They had consumed him, taken everything that was left of the man they once knew. Tom took a step forward, his voice shaking. "Dad, we're here. It's okay. We're going to get you help." But as he approached, Frank suddenly stopped scratching. He turned slowly to face them, his eyes wide and filled with a kind of primal terror. His mouth hung open, as though he were about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he pointed toward the front door. The scratching had stopped. And then, the door swung open. The last thing they heard was the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps, approaching from the darkness outside.